Commissural fibers, also known as commissures, they connect in the gray areas between the two hemispheres. So we're going to see that connecting the two hemispheres. So this is going to be a sagittal section, and coming out at you, these green lines right here, those are going to be part of the commissural fibers that make up the corpus callosum in this area right here. And so corpus callosum is going to be the commissural fibers that connect the two hemispheres. To find this, if you go down into the longitudinal fissure, the bottom of the longitudinal fissure is going to be the corpus callosum, and you guys will see this in the laboratory. So that's going to connect the two hemispheres. We also, let me see if there's a better, and you can also see that, so here's your longitudinal fissure here. Go down the longitudinal fissure, what you're going to hit at the bottom of the longitudinal fissure is going to be that corpus callosum that contains all those commissural fibers that connect the two hemispheres. We also have association fibers. Association fibers connect different parts of the same hemispheres. There's short association fibers, so if you want to connect one gyrus to the next gyrus, that's going to be a short association fiber. There's also long association fibers that connect one lobe to the next lobe. So lots of communication going on. So we're going to see these association fibers. So these are short association fibers as it's connecting one gyrus to the next one here. Here's long association fibers that's connecting the frontal lobe to the occipital lobe. And lastly, we have projection fibers. Projection fibers connect the cortex to the rest of the nervous system and the body's receptors and effectors. So this is connecting the cerebral hemispheres to the rest of the nervous system and to outside of the body. And you can see these projection fibers coming down, heading towards the diencephalon. Those are the projection fibers. And you can see the projection fibers here as well. There's also, within that white matter, some islands of gray matter, and the ones that we're going to talk about are called the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei are in each hemisphere, and there are three masses of gray matter. We're going to have the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the caudate nucleus. And what these basal nuclei are going to be important for is they're going to influence motor function by having to regulate initiation and termination of movements. So basically, they're going to be communicating with the precentral gyrus to be able to turn things on and turn things off. And so they're also going to help initiate and terminate some cognitive processes as well, such as attention, memory, and planning. So we have the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. You could actually start combining these nuclei together. So if you put the putamen with the globus pallidus, you form what's called the lentiform nucleus. The lentiform nucleus plus the caudate nucleus form what's called this corpus striatum. So those three together form a corpus striatum, which means striated body, and I'll show you why it's considered that in a second. So if you look for these different components, so here's the basal nuclei, the three major components. Here's the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. And remember, this is only a two-dimensional structure, but if you look from a different view, you start to understand this is a three-dimensional structure. So you can see here the caudate nucleus, for example. Also, here's the lentiform nucleus, and that lentiform nucleus being what we actually got when we combined the putamen with the globus pallidus. Now, why is this called the corpus striatum, or the striated body? Look where these three are located. And look what runs right through the middle of them. We have these projection fibers, which is making up what are called the internal capsule. And this internal capsule runs right through the middle of these basal nuclei. And so these basal nuclei, these three here, are often called the striated body, or the corpus striatum, because of those projection fibers that are coming right through the middle of them. The basal nuclei are involved with two different diseases. Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease. In Huntington's disease, it's actually a degeneration of the basal nuclei due to the accumulation of a mutant Huntington protein. So the cells of the basal nuclei in Huntington's disease begin to die off because they produce what's called a Huntington protein, a mutant Huntington protein that causes the cells to die. And then later the cerebral cortex degenerates. It's a fatal hereditary disease, strikes during middle age typically, and the individuals have wild, jerky motions. And so if you've ever watched House, one of the interns that he was working with, she would knock things, her arm would jerkily move and she would knock over the coffee or something like that. And she was actually starting to develop having the onset of Huntington's disease. And so you have too much movement associated with Huntington's disease. Later, you also have mental deteriorations. It's fatal within 15 years of the onset of symptoms. And so really here you have an overstimulation of motor drive. And that's opposite of Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease also includes the basal nuclei. And it's not that the basal nuclei degenerate, but another part of the brain. There is a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra. It's in the midbrain. The substantia nigra actually communicates through dopamine with the basal nuclei. And in Parkinson's disease, we're seeing the degeneration of those dopamine-releasing neurons in the substantia nigra of the midbrain. So the substantia nigra dies. Now the basal nuclei don't have that control over top of them that they had before from the substantia nigra, and so now we're seeing that the basal nuclei become overactive, and it causes a problem with being able to initiate motion, and so there's an understimulation of motor drive. However, they do get tremors at rest with Parkinson's disease, and these tremors are involuntary skeletal muscle contractions. So a lot of times, because this is an inhibition of motor drive with Parkinson's disease, very often you'll see someone with Parkinson's disease sort of shuffling along because it's very hard for them to initiate motion. So they shuffle along when they walk. Let's move on to the diencephalon. So the diencephalon develops from the diencephalon, so that portion of the brain. And you remember it's very deep within the brain because the telencephalon took on that rapid growth to envelop the diencephalon. The diencephalon includes the thalamus, most of this area, the hypothalamus, as well as the epithalamus. I'll talk about each one of those. First is the thalamus. The thalamus helps in mediation of sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning and memory, and very, very important is it acts as a relay station for most sensory information ascending into the cerebral cortex. So most sensory information, we'll talk about one exception later on, but most sensory information has to stop over in the thalamus for a nice synapse or two, for reorganization, before it goes up to the cerebral cortex, before you're even aware of it. It's going to be coming here. And again, the thalamus actually makes up the majority of the diencephalon, but there are two other areas as well. One of those areas is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be the main visceral control center for the body. So it's acting as the autonomic control center for the body and for center for emotional response. Because it's doing a lot with autonomic control centers and such, it's going to regulate body temperature, food intake, water balance, thirst, sleep-wake cycles, and endocrine functioning. And we've talked a lot about the endocrine functioning control that it has over the anterior pituitary. So its influence is vital for maintaining homeostasis, that relatively stable internal environment within the body. There are two projections that you can see of the hypothalamus on the surface of the brain. We have the mammillary bodies and the infundibulum. So if we go to the undersurface of the brain, so we're looking at an inferior surface of the brain. Here's going to be the optic nerves. This is the optic chiasma, optic tracts. We come back a little bit, and right in this area here, you can't see it on this brain, but on this area here coming out, right behind near the optic chiasma, is going to be the infundibulum, that stalk of hypothalamic tissue that's going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Just posterior to that are the mammillary bodies. Now, these have nothing to do with lactation, it's just that a scientist looked at them, thought they looked like a pair of breasts, and so that's where the name is coming from. They actually have to do with, I think, motion or movement of something. That is the epithalamus. The epithalamus helps to regulate sleep-wake cycle via the pineal body with the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus has a role in wake-sleep cycle, but the epithalamus is going to also do that as well, so there's communication between the two. And as we know, there's the pineal body, which hangs off the back of the epithalamus, and it secretes melatonin, and we've talked about that before. So if you go into the transverse cerebral fissure, so stick your hand in the transverse cerebral fissure, separate the occipital lobe from the cerebellum, and get into that space, you can come all the way back, and you can see the pineal body hanging off. The pineal body is called the pineal body because it looks like a pine cone. That's where the name came from. You might also hear pineal gland as well. We then have the brain stem. The brain stem consists of three parts, from superior to inferior. We have the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. The brain stem produces autonomic behaviors necessary for survival, provides pathway for fiber tracts leading superiorly, inferiorly, so lots of information is traveling through the brain stem, and also has a lot of nuclei associated with it. So remember the setup here, you have some sort of lumen, go around with a little bit of gray matter and then white matter. In that white matter, you're going to find islands of gray matter called nuclei. And those nuclei include 10 of the 12 cranial nerve nuclei. So we're looking at this region here. This is going to be the midbrain, this is the pons, and then this is the medulla, which then connects to the spinal cord. This is a sagittal section, give you the same view. This area here is going to be called the midbrain, followed by the pons, and then the medulla, which then connects to the spinal cord. Remember that the cerebellum does hang off the back of the brainstem with a lot of connections into the pons because they came from the same developmental structure.
I have a question.
Yep.
Out of curiosity, can we see those ventricles you mentioned before from this section?
You cannot see the lateral ventricles because the lateral ventricles are actually inside here. Within the cerebellum, but this would be the area of the third. Third would be in this area here. This comes down here. The best one you can see right now, this is the fourth ventricle right here.
Okay.
And let's see if you can see it from the other view. I think if there's any other sections of the brain that are going to show that. Nope. So right now, the best view that you're, of any of the ventricles you're going to see is probably fourth ventricle, which is right here.
Okay.
There is a model up in the laboratory that's going to show you all of the ventricles. So make sure that somebody shows that to you. Yeah.
When does the mesencephalon become the midbrain? Like around what age?
Mesencephalon doesn't do much changing, so it's sort of mesencephalon, and all of a sudden somebody just calls it the midbrain. There's no, I don't think there's a particular pinpoint that I've seen that they start calling it that. There's not a lot of changes that occur to it to actually become it. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk about the midbrain first. And let me show you these other images too. These are actually pulling out the brain stem away from the cerebrum. It also left the diencephalon on top. And so here you can actually see the thalamus here, hypothalamus here, epithalamus is going to be back in this area here. And so you can see that that's still sitting on top, but then this is going to be midbrain here, pons, and then medulla, spinal cord. This is a posterior view, and so here's your epithalamus, here's thalamus, and so this is going to be midbrain, pons, and medulla. So let's talk about the midbrain first. It comes from the mesencephalon, And we're gonna see that the midbrain has a number of projections that you can see along the surface. And we also see that there are a lot of nuclei in the white matter. Some of those nuclei are actually associated with cranial nerves. And cranial nerves 3 and 4 will actually have nuclei associated with the midbrain or found within the midbrain. So if we look for the different structures, the first thing is if we're on the ventral side, we're gonna see the cerebral peduncles. This is going to be a sagittal section, so we're not seeing it so well in here, but this is the area we're interested in, which is gonna be the midbrain. You can see that some people still call it the mesencephalon, because it really doesn't change much. So some people call it the mesencephalon, some people call it the midbrain. This is a ventral view here, anterior view, and you can see these two structures right here. These are the cerebral peduncles. The cerebral peduncles are important because they contain the very large corticospinal tracts. The name tells you exactly what it's containing. Corticospinal, so it means it's coming from a cortex, it's going down into the spinal cord. Specifically, those corticospinal tracts are containing axons coming from the primary motor cortex along the precentral gyrus. So this here, these bulges here are there because underneath that is going to be those large corticospinal tracts are containing information coming down from the precentral gyrus, so the primary motor cortex. There has not been any crossover yet, so this cerebral peduncle is containing the information for the contralateral body, and this one's containing information for the contralateral body. The other two structures, whereas the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi, these are on the dorsal surface. So if you look at a ventral view, you can see these, here's the epithalamus with the pineal gland. We go right below that and there's these 4 bulges. There's the 2 superior colliculi, one is called a colliculus, 2 are colliculi, and then the inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are important, you can see those here. These are going to be important in a visual reflex center for coordination of the eye movements with your head and neck. So if you're out on the street and you're trying to watch a car as it goes through an intersection, you need to coordinate your head and eye movements. And so to coordinate those movements, that's the function of the cells there and the superior colliculi. Now for the inferior colliculi, you just did it. There's an auditory reflex, and you guys just did it. It's called the startle reflex. Before information goes to the primary auditory cortex, so before you're even aware of it, information makes it here to the inferior colliculi. So it's called the startle reflex because you turn your head towards a sound before you even perceive it. And that is obviously very important for safety and defense. So you're actually programmed to actually turn your head to a sound before a very large, loud sound before you actually perceive it. And that's the importance of the inferior colliculi. We also have associated with midbrain the substantia nigra, which we've already talked about before. The substantia nigra is going to be what degenerates in Parkinson's disease. If we go into the midbrain, this is going to be anterior, this is going to be posterior. Here is the cerebral peduncle. And the first portion of the cerebral peduncle are those corticospinal tracts that we talked about. So this is what's controlling for the contralateral side of the body for skeletal muscle movements, or what's carrying the information is going to the contralateral side of the body. It's actually being controlled by the precentral gyrus up in the frontal lobe. But right posterior to that are these neurons in this area here. This is the substantia nigra, and it's this area that's going to degenerate in Parkinson's disease. Normally, they're releasing dopamine onto the basal nuclei and helping to control those cells. Next is the pons. When it comes to the pons is going to be the major component really of the ponds is going to be conduction tracts that course between higher brain centers and the spinal cord. So basically ponds means bridge, so it's conducting a lot of information from one location to another. So it's going between the spinal cord and higher brain centers, and also between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. And so remember that the metencephalon is what the pons develops from it, but the metencephalon also gives you the cerebellum. So it makes sense that there's connections between the pons and the cerebellum. The cerebellum is going to be very important in coordinating movements, and so there obviously is going to have to be information going between that and the primary motor cortex. And so if you see the middle cerebellar peduncles, that's going to be where we're seeing axons going between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. There's also gray matter in the pons, and even though a lot of it is white matter, the nuclei here include nuclei for the trigeminal, the abducens, the facial, and portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve. You can see this is going to be anterior, this is going to be posterior. You can see part of the fourth ventricle here, because remember from the metencephalon we do get portion of the fourth ventricle. You can see that there is a lot of white matter associated with this area. There are some nuclei though as well. Here we see the trigeminal nuclei, and on the sides here are the middle cerebellar peduncles. And those middle cerebellar peduncles contain axons that are going between the primary motor cortex and the cerebellum. Next is the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is going to be an autonomic reflex center housing important visceral motor nuclei. So here we have the cardiovascular centers, here we have the respiratory center, so we have cells here that are going to control things like how fast the heart's pumping, how hard the heart is pumping. We also have how deep inspiration is going to take place, how fast inspiration is going to be taking place, and this is controlling that. And so this is a lot of autonomic activity, things for daily housekeeping activities. Well, I also mentioned that, if you go back to hypothalamus, this is the main visceral control center, acts as an autonomic control center. The way to think of this is the hypothalamus is management. It knows what needs to be done. It sends its instructions through the medulla. So the medulla is going to have the nuclei that then do the work for you, send the information out to those organs that then be able to do the job. You can see the projections off the medulla. You're going to have the pyramids on the ventral surface, and then you have two tubercles on the dorsal surface that we'll take a look at. We also have nuclei still in this area. We have the rest of the vestibular cochlear nuclei. Then we have the glossopharyngeal, the vagus portion of the accessory, and the glossopharyngeal nuclei here as well. And here we see the pyramids. This is going to be the anterior side, this is the posterior side. These are the pyramids. The pyramids are going to be the corticospinal tracts again. So those corticospinal tracts are coming down from the precentral gyrus. The interesting thing is, though, in the medulla, there's something called the ductusation of the pyramids. And the ductusation means crossing over. So it's in the medulla at the ductusation of the pyramids that we actually have the crossing over of the corticospinal tracts. So if you have a lesion of your corticospinal tract superior to that area, you would have a contralateral deficit. If you had it below that area, you would have an ipsilateral deficit because of the crossing over at the medulla oblongata. We also have associated with the medulla oblongata two projections as well. On the dorsal side, we have the gracile tubercle and the cuneate tubercle as well, and you can see those are going to be in these areas here. I think that's a good spot to stop for with today. So why don't we stop there? We'll talk about the cerebellum tomorrow and then start talking